Hey guys! Tonight we begin with one of the bloodiest, boldest and secretly most scandalous corners of the Roman world. Gladiators. Yes, those oiled-up, muscle-bound warriors who fought to the death for fame, freedom, or just because their manager said it was good for ticket sales. But tonight, we're not here for the clashing steel or roaring crowds. We're here for something far more dangerous. Love. Because believe it or not, gladiators weren't just warriors. They were sex symbols, living fantasies, objects of lust, obsession, fear, and sometimes deeply complicated affection. And while Rome tried to write the rules, love always found a way to bend or break them. So before we sharpen the trident or adjust our loincloth, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy strange history and bedtime storytelling, with a slightly inappropriate wink, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I'm always amazed by how many of you are dozing off to gladiator facts at 3:12 AM in Denmark. Now dim the lights, maybe light a candle that smells like ancient sweat and sandalwood, and let's enter the arena, not for combat, but for connection. Because in Rome, a gladiator's heart was often just as bruised as his body. In theory, gladiators were property, owned by a lanista, a trainer/manager/human trafficker, who made sure his men were fed, oiled and ready to perform. Not unlike a modern sports agent, except with more chains and fewer endorsement deals. And while some gladiators were prisoners of war or convicted criminals, others actually volunteered. Yes, imagine being so broke, bored, or hungry for fame that you willingly signed up to be stabbed for a living. That's dedication or insanity. Rome couldn't tell the difference. Once inside the ludus, the gladiator training school, your life became highly structured. Wake up, train, eat, train more. Don't die in sparring. And don't under any circumstances fall in love without permission. Because like everything else in your life, romance had to be sanctioned, profitable, or at least not inconvenient. You see, gladiators were investments. Their bodies belonged to someone else. And just like a prize racehorse or a particularly attractive hostage, their value came from performance, not personal happiness. A relationship? That could be a distraction, a liability, a scandal waiting to happen. And yet, love still bloomed, in stolen glances, in hidden notes, in whispered conversations behind barracks at night, when the roar of the crowds was replaced by the quiet rustle of straw beds and racing hearts. But let's not pretend these were simple romances. Gladiators weren't just men with muscles. They were symbols. Symbols of strength, masculinity, and exotic danger. Roman women, especially the wealthy ones, loved that. It's hard to resist a man who can kill 3 Thracians before lunch and still compliment your hair afterward. But these weren't casual flings. If a patrician woman got caught sleeping with a gladiator, she risked social ruin. That didn't stop them. It just made it hotter. The poet Juvenal tells us about Epia, a senator's wife who ran off with a gladiator. She left her pearls, her status, her husband, and followed her new lover to the provinces. Why? According to Juvenal, it was because gladiators were, and I quote, sweaty, scarred, and irresistible. That's ancient Rome's version of a bad boy phase, but not all love was forbidden. Sometimes a gladiator was rewarded with a woman, sometimes a slave, sometimes a local admirer, sometimes even his dominuse's daughter. These relationships were often transactional, but now and then something real emerged, and in the rarest of cases a gladiator might even win his freedom and choose to settle down. There are tombstones in Rome dedicated by women to their fallen gladiator lovers. One inscription reads simply, "To the man who made me feel alive, I light this flame for you still." That's not just romantic, it's heartbreaking, because gladiators didn't live long. The average lifespan was about 5 fights. If you made it to 10, you were a legend. If you fell in love somewhere along the way, well, that was either divine luck or emotional suicide. And don't get me started on the fans. Romans didn't just watch gladiators, they obsessed, carved their names into walls, threw undergarments into the arena, left love notes on the bathhouse walls. Imagine being half naked, covered in dirt and bruises, and someone yells from the stands, "I want to have your baby!" It was a vibe. But being desired didn't mean being respected. Gladiators were still beneath Roman citizens in legal and social standing. You could love them, but not marry them. You could desire them, but never claim them publicly. Unless, of course, you were another gladiator. And even then, things got complicated. Inside the ludus, bonds were formed. Men trained together, bled together, comforted each other after brutal matches. And yes, sometimes they fell in love, or something close to it. Brotherhood blurred with intimacy. And in a world where death was always looming, a moment of tenderness might be the only rebellion you had left. Even Roman satirists couldn't resist writing about gladiator sex. Martial jokes that women wanted gladiators more than their own husbands. Graffiti in Pompeii declares, "Celadus the Thracian makes the girls sigh." That's basically a 1st century thirst trap. So tonight we're not going to follow the sword, we're going to follow the heart, because beneath the armour, behind the blood, and beyond the cheers, gladiators were just people, passionate, conflicted, vulnerable, and sometimes just trying to steal one kiss before the next fight. Let's begin then with the first layer of this forbidden love story. Not the fans, not the fame, but the simple, brutal question. Who were gladiators even allowed to love, and who was completely off limits? Keep your eyes closed, let the sand settle, and drift with me into the barracks where hearts beat just as loudly as war drums, because in ancient Rome, even love had to fight for its life. So, who could a gladiator love? The short answer, basically no one. The long answer, it's complicated, which is Roman for, love whoever you want, just be ready to suffer for it. Let's start with the basics. In the eyes of Roman law, a gladiator wasn't really a person. He was property. Technically, a servus gladiatorius, a slave gladiator, owned either by the state, a private investor, or a lanista, which is the Roman word for sweaty talent agent with a whip. Being property meant you didn't get to make choices about your own body, let alone your heart. You could be fed, trained, punished, or rented out, sometimes all in the same day. Romance. That was just another item on someone else's balance sheet. If a gladiator had a lover, it was either approved by their owner or done entirely in secret. And secrecy in a gladiator barracks was about as practical as whispering in a bathhouse. Everyone knew everything. Who was sneaking into which cell? Who got caught exchanging bracelets? Who looked a little too long at the new recruit from Gaul? It wasn't exactly subtle. But even in that chaos, emotions found a way to root themselves. Gladiators formed attachments. Sometimes it was with other fighters, sometimes with servants, scribes, or even handlers. Love often came not from freedom, but from proximity. Who stitched up your wounds? Who shared your rations when you were too injured to walk? Who watched your match like it might be the last time? And yet, if you got too close to someone, especially without approval, there were consequences. A gladiator who let love distract him was seen as weak, unfocused, and weakness in the arena got you killed. That's not just a metaphor. If your Lanista thought you were getting soft, or worse, defiant, he could separate you from your partner, punish you with isolation, or throw you into the next fight without armour as a lesson in priorities. Even the Roman elite, those wine-soaked senators with too many concubines and not enough moral consistency, believed that love was a danger to discipline, especially for slaves. If you cared too much about someone, you might rebel, you might run, you might fight not for the crowd, but for someone waiting outside the gates. And Rome couldn't have that. So who was off limits? In theory, Roman citizens. In practice, absolutely everyone you actually wanted. A gladiator caught in a relationship with a domina, a noblewoman, was committing social treason. Roman matrons were expected to be chaste, dignified, and married to men who looked like they hadn't fought anyone since they got their first toga. Falling for a gladiator? That was scandal, filth, and lowbrow lust all rolled into one, which of course made it even more tempting. Women like Epia, the senator's wife who ran off with her gladiator boyfriend, weren't just rare, they were legends. Not for their romance, but for the chaos it caused. Juvenal, that eternally bitter Roman satirist, mocked her endlessly. He had scars, he reeked of blood, and yet she followed him across the sea. But what Juvenal didn't admit, Rome loved stories like that, even when they condemned them. What about female slaves? Well, that was even trickier. On paper, two slaves falling in love might seem innocent, but slave owners didn't like their property-forming alliances. Love meant loyalty to someone other than your master. That was dangerous. In some Ludus schools, female slaves were banned entirely. In others, they were present but closely monitored. The idea was pleasure, maybe. Emotional connection. Absolutely not. And here's where things get even more absurd. Some gladiators were actually rewarded with women after winning a fight. Not freedom, not better food, but a night companion. Sometimes a prostitute, sometimes a servant. Occasionally just a fan pulled from the stands. It wasn't love, it was a perk. And if you fell for that person, good luck keeping them. They were gone by morning. Occasionally a gladiators were given permission to form a contubernium, a kind of unofficial slave marriage. It wasn't legally binding. It didn't come with rings or ceremonies, but it meant two people could be acknowledged as a pair, share living space, and raise children, until one of them was sold, punished, or killed. Not exactly a happy ending, but it was something. A thread of humanity in a world designed to strip that away. One papyrus fragment tells the story of a gladiator named Sabinus, who tried to buy his lover's freedom with his winnings. He fought more matches than he needed to, took more damage, trained harder than anyone else. And when he finally had the coin, she had already been sold. No one told him where. His story ends there. No grave, no poem. Just a note in a merchant's ledger. That's love in the age of empire. Transactional, brutal, and constantly interrupted. So if you were a gladiator, who could you love? Maybe the healer who bandaged your ribs. Maybe the cook who gave you extra figs. Maybe the fighter who watched your back in the arena and shared his only clean tunic before a match. You loved who you could, when you could, and you did it in whispers, in eye contact, in the smallest gifts and glances that couldn't be taxed or taken away. Because even when your life wasn't your own, your feelings still belonged to you. Of course, that didn't stop Rome from trying to tax those too. In the next chapter of this sleepless saga, we'll take a peek at one of the greatest open secrets in ancient Rome. How noble women, proper, perfumed, high-born Roman matrons, could not get enough of gladiators. Affairs, bribes, handwritten notes in blood. Yes, blood. and the worst-kept romantic scandals in the empire. But for now, close your eyes. Picture the flickering torches of the training yard, the quiet shuffle of sand beneath bare feet, and the soft sounds of two people falling asleep, just inches apart, pretending not to care. Because in ancient Rome, love wasn't illegal, it was just inconvenient. Of all the dangerous things a gladiator could face in Rome, wild beasts, rival fighters, poorly cooked lentils, there was one threat that truly terrified the Lanistas: Roman women. Because if a gladiator's job was to be strong, silent and sweaty, Roman noblewomen's job, at least unofficially, was to pretend they didn't notice. And they were terrible at it. They noticed. It wasn't subtle. These women weren't drooling into their goblets like starstruck teenagers. No, they were much worse. They were strategic, deliberate, and most importantly, they had money. And money could get you a long way in ancient Rome, especially when it came to getting very close to the man you just watched beat someone unconscious with a trident. Let's start with the obvious. Gladiators were the ancient world's version of celebrity. They were famous, dangerous, and extremely shirtless. Their names were known. Their faces were scratched into walls. Their victories were sung by children in alleyways. Even emperors had favourites. But unlike most celebrities, gladiators were also accessible. You could meet one, visit the training yard, bribe a servant, leave a note. In a world without reality shows, these men were as close as it got to living fantasy. So what did these noble women actually do? They wrote letters, in lipstick, on wax tablets, on scraps of linen. One Pompeian wall inscription reads, "Calidus the Thracian makes all the girls sigh." Another simply says, "I love the one who fights like Mars." Subtle? Not really. And Mars, the god of war, was probably flattered. Wealthy women sent gifts to, jewellery, perfume, sometimes even property deeds, because nothing says, "I want you" like half a vineyard. But their most powerful weapon? Freedom. If a woman wanted a gladiator badly enough, and had the coin, she could negotiate his release, buy his contract, own him. That's right. Ancient Rome had sugar mummies, and they were ruthless. But this wasn't just about lust. Okay, it was mostly about lust, but also rebellion. These women were trapped in political marriages, often with older men who treated affection like a business deal. Gladiators, on the other hand, were raw, unfiltered, and, according to Roman satirists, wildly skilled in bed. Juvenal, never one to be polite, suggested that no woman could resist the one who made the crowd cheer. And the higher the status of the woman, the more scandalous the affair. That was part of the thrill. For a noble woman, sleeping with a gladiator wasn't just pleasure, it was power play. It was a slap in the face to her husband, her class, and half of Roman society. Let's talk about Epia again, Rome's favourite runaway senator's wife. She left her privileged life behind to follow her gladiator lover all the way to Egypt. Not because he was rich, not because he was charming, but because, according to Juvenal, his body excited her more than wealth or rank, which, in Latin, is as close as you get to thirst posting. Epia wasn't alone. History is full of women like her, wives of powerful men, sneaking into the ludus at night, dressed in veils, slipping coins into guards' palms, whispering promises in candlelit rooms. These were not one-night stands. Some lasted years, others resulted in children, and a few ended very, very badly. Because make no mistake, these were high-stakes affairs. If discovered, a noblewoman could be divorced, exiled, or worse. Her lover tortured, executed, or thrown into a death match he was never meant to survive. Love wasn't forbidden, but humiliation of the elite, that was unforgivable. One story tells of a female patron who kept her gladiator hidden in a villa outside Rome, pretending he was a mute gardener. He wasn't mute, just very disciplined. Their affair lasted 3 years before a jealous cousin exposed them. He was killed. She was shipped to Gaul, and the roses in that garden never bloomed quite the same again. But not all relationships ended in tragedy. Some gladiators were smart. They played into their roles, flirted, manipulated. Some even genuinely fell in love. After all, in a world where you might die tomorrow, today's affection mattered more. One inscription on a tombstone in Ostia reads, "To my beloved Flavia, who gave me a life beyond the sword." It's unclear if Flavia was a noble woman, a freed woman, or just someone who saw him as more than a killer. But whoever she was, she mattered enough for him to leave her name carved in stone. Of course, public opinion was mixed. Roman society loved a juicy scandal, so long as it wasn't their wife. Poets mocked these women. Senators scowled. But the people loved it. Romance sold tickets. The idea that a gladiator might be fighting for love, not just survival, added spice to the spectacle. Can you imagine the tension? 2 fighters in the arena. One locks eyes with the noblewoman in the front row. She nods. He wins. She throws him a rose. The crowd roars. Her husband faints. It was Rome's version of a soap opera, only bloodier. And through it all, the gladiator remained the object of desire and danger, living at the intersection of passion and property. He couldn't love freely, but he could be loved fiercely, by women who risked everything for a few stolen nights, a whispered promise, or the hope that maybe this time it would end differently. Next up, we'll leave the villa gates and look outward, at the fans, the groupies, the everyday Romans who scribbled hearts in the dirt and dreamed of touching the arm of the man who just survived a lion. Because not all obsessions wore silk and gold. Some wore tunics, carried bread, and cried in the stands. For now, drift into sleep like a gladiator slipping into shadows, the scent of rose oil still on his skin, and a name whispered in the dark he'll never forget. Because in ancient Rome, some women didn't want safety. They wanted danger, and gladiators gave them both. It wasn't just senators' wives and silk-veiled nobility sneaking into the barracks. No, gladiators had fans, and not just a few. They had legions of them. Poor, rich, old, young, male, female. If you lived in Rome and had eyes, chances are you had a favourite gladiator, and you were probably thinking about him more often than was medically recommended. Because if you think modern celebrity culture is intense, paparazzi, fan fiction, concert stalking, you need to remember Rome had graffiti, and it used it with unhinged devotion. Across the walls of Pompeii, there are scribbled messages that read like love letters, thirst traps, and desperate DMs all rolled into one. Crescens the net fighter is the delight of all the girls, one says. Another declares, Celadus the Thracian makes the girls sigh. No subtlety, just raw emotional chaos carved right into the stucco for everyone, including your husband, to see. And these weren't elite women. They were shopkeepers, slaves, bakers, stable girls. People who watched from the upper seats, squinting through the dust, and still managed to fall completely in love with a man they'd never even met. Or maybe they had met him, just once, briefly, at a tavern, or the baths, or on the street, shirt half off, bruised and smiling like he knew, because he did. Gladiators knew their effect. They were trained to fight, but also to perform, to flex, to pose, to lock eyes with the crowd and look just dangerous enough to be exciting, but not so wild that they couldn't be fantasized about. It was an art form, and the crowd, especially the women, ate it up. But it wasn't just performance. Fans wanted them, and some got them. See, being a gladiator came with something very rare for slaves: sexual capital. They couldn't own property, but they could own attention. Their bodies were currency, and if they played their cards right, they could cash in. Some would arrange secret liaisons with fans, often through servants, backdoor deals, or bribed guards. A few ludus schools even allowed this kind of access, for a fee of course. Call it Roman meet and greet, a kiss, a conversation, maybe more. It depended on who was paying. For some fans that was the dream, one night with the man they cheered for, a story to whisper later, a scar to touch, proof that they'd been chosen, even if only briefly. It was transactional, yes, but it was also personal, emotional, sometimes even tender, and occasionally reciprocated. One story from the writings of Suetonius, whose entire job was historical gossip basically, mentions a fan who snuck into a gladiator's quarters by dressing as a healer. She brought herbs, wrapped his arm, and whispered her love in his ear. They say he kissed her and asked her to come back. Whether that happened or not doesn't really matter. The fact that the story was told, passed around, carved into walls, that says everything. These men were more than fighters. They were romantic projections, blank canvases onto which fans poured desire, fantasy, and sometimes heartbreak. Of course, not every fan encounter was dreamy. Some were messy, some were exploitative, and some ended in fights, because where there's passion, there's usually at least one jealous ex with a dagger. And gender, that wasn't a barrier either. Gladiators attracted men as well. Rome was famously flexible. Relationships between men weren't unusual, though public displays were another matter. Gladiators were admired by everyone, from young men scribbling hearts on scrolls to bored aristocrats leaving generous offerings at their barracks. There's even a story, half rumour, half poem, about an aging nobleman who paid a gladiator to simply eat dinner with him once a week. No arena, no blood, just stories, laughter, and silence. And when the gladiator died, the man lit a flame every day in his honour. Love, friendship, obsession. Rome didn't always draw clear lines, but if you were a fan, the risks were real. Gladiators weren't marriage material. They were legally off limits. No citizen could marry a slave. And even if you dreamed about it, drew hearts around his name, wrote songs, left figs at his door, it was a fantasy. A dangerous one. A gladiator could be dead by morning, or sold, or replaced. Some fans became stalkers, others became patrons, a few became legends, but most simply watched, cheered, loved silently, and hoped their favourite fighter made it to the next match. And yet, those silent fans left behind more than cheers. They left walls full of devotion, poems scratched into stone, broken combs and ribbons tossed into the dirt where he last stood. Because in ancient Rome, love didn't need permission, it only needed a pulse. Moving on, we'll go behind the arena gates, into the heart of the ludus, where gladiators didn't just train or fight, they lived together, slept beside each other, bled for each other, and sometimes fell in love. Because sometimes the person who held you after battle was more than just a comrade. Close your eyes and picture the dusty walls of Pompeii, covered in love notes, each one a little whisper from a heart that hoped for more than just blood. Because in the Roman Empire, gladiators didn't just fight to the death, they were loved to death. Inside the walls of the ludus, the roar of the crowd faded. What remained were sore muscles, damp straw mattresses, and men too tired to pretend they didn't feel anything. Gladiators trained together, slept side by side, ate the same meals, nursed the same wounds, and sometimes shared the same fate. Every day was a rhythm of blood, sweat, and discipline, but every night, beneath flickering lamplight and aching ribs, something else flickered too. Something gentler, quieter, far more forbidden. Because behind the chainmail and posture, some of these men loved each other. Now, ancient Rome wasn't particularly squeamish about same-sex relationships. If you were a free Roman citizen, especially a man of status, it was perfectly acceptable to pursue a younger male partner, so long as you kept up appearances and remembered who was supposed to be dominant. But gladiators weren't citizens. They weren't even men in the eyes of the law. They were property, and property falling in love with property. That wasn't romantic. That was dangerous. The Roman system thrived on isolation. Gladiators were meant to compete, not connect. But of course, they connected anyway. Imagine this. Two young fighters from different provinces, one captured in war, the other sold by debt. They didn't speak the same language at first, but pain is universal. One helps the other to his feet after training, shares his water, bandages a wound on a shoulder no one else has touched in months. At first, it's camaraderie. Then it becomes something more. A glance that lingers, a hand that stays too long. A heartbeat skipped under a bruised chest. It wasn't always spoken. It didn't need to be. In the dim stillness of the barracks, affection took whatever form it could. A shared blanket, a warm laugh after a near-death match, or the simple fact that someone gave you the bigger portion of bread without saying a word. Sometimes it was physical, sometimes it wasn't, but always it was a risk. Because if the Lannister caught on, punishment was swift. Separation, public humiliation, extra matches against harder opponents. Gladiator schools weren't monasteries, but they had rules. And one of the unspoken ones, emotional attachment was weakness, and weakness didn't win matches, but still some dared. There are scraps of graffiti that hint at it, names carved together, hearts with swords through them. In one ludus in Capua, a wall bears the faint inscription, "He bled, and I wept." It could mean anything, or everything. There are also stories passed down, never officially recorded but whispered in the margins of Roman gossip. One tells of a pair of fighters known only as the Dacian and Felix. They fought as a team in paired battles, their coordination unmatched. Spectators loved them, called them brothers of the blade. But behind the scenes, they were lovers, slept in the same cell, shared a tunic, wrote letters no one else could read. When Felix was killed in the arena, speared in the back by a cheating opponent, the Dacian refused to fight, stood in the sand and dropped his weapon. The crowd booed. The Lannister screamed. He was executed the next day. Some say he smiled before the blade fell. Of course, the official records don't mention love. They say insubordination. They say refusal to perform. But the memory of their story lingered, because even Rome couldn't completely silence something that real. There were others, unnamed, forgotten. A shoulder leaned against at night, a hand held before a match, two men whispering prayers in a language older than the empire itself. Not everyone was caught. Not everyone died. Some survived, fought side by side, and when they were freed, if they were freed, they left together. One retired gladiator years later dedicated an altar to the man who kept my heart beating in the barracks and in battle. No name, just a heart carved above 2 crossed swords, and maybe that's enough, because what mattered wasn't that they were remembered, it was that they were real. In a world that tried to make the machines of violence they loved like poets, quietly, fiercely, in defiance of everything Rome expected. Some of these men died in the same fights, others lived long enough to see each other scarred and greying, and though the Empire didn't write songs about them, their stories still hum beneath the stones. In the next chapter, we'll step out of the barracks and into the villa, into the complicated, intoxicating, and often morally bankrupt world of gladiators and their owners. Because sometimes the person who fed you also wanted to own your heart. But for now, picture 2 men, backs against the same wall, breathing in unison, not because they planned it, but because it was the only way they knew how to survive. Because in ancient Rome, even when everything else was taken from you, you still had the right to feel. If you were a gladiator, love was rarely simple, but when the object of your affection also owned you, things got even messier. Because in ancient Rome, power wasn't just political, it was personal. Every relationship had a hierarchy, and when one person could buy, sell, punish, or reward the other with a snap of the fingers, affection became a negotiation, sometimes tender, sometimes terrifying. Welcome to the villa. Imagine waking up sore from training, sun pouring in through the bars of your cell. You're summoned, not by your trainer, not by your medic, but by the master of the house. Or maybe the mistress. She's wearing silk. You're still covered in bruises. She asks you to pour her wine, then to stay, then to smile. Now what do? A gladiator's owner, called a dominus if male, domina if female, was more than just a title. They had absolute control. Your matches, your food, your punishments, even your death were all in their hands. So when desire entered the equation, consent became complicated. Some relationships were one-sided. The master saw his prized fighter as a toy, a trophy, something to show off at dinner parties and reward with scraps of intimacy. Others, especially among wealthy Roman women, were fueled by obsession. A domina might invite a gladiator to serve at her table, then order him to her chamber when the guests had left, not with affection, with expectation. And yet, sometimes it was more than that. Power has gravity, and in Rome, where tenderness was rare and vulnerability was dangerous, even the cruelest relationships could sprout moments of strange, almost accidental care. A mistress might heal her gladiator's wounds herself. A master might release one man out of all the others without ever saying why. Did they love them? Maybe. Did they own them? Absolutely. One case from the city of Antium tells of a noblewoman who fell deeply for her personal guard, technically a slave, but also a trained gladiator. She wrote poems for him, hid him in her chambers. When he was injured in a match, she wept publicly, scandalous enough that the Senate launched an inquiry. She was sent away. He was sold. That's Rome's version of couples therapy. In the worst cases, owners used affection as a leash. Gladiators were rewarded with wine, better food, silk tunics, not for their victories, but for obedience in bed. And if they resisted, the punishment could be brutal. You didn't just lose privileges, you lost protection. In some cases, you were sent into matches you weren't meant to survive. And yet we find inscriptions, carvings in the walls of villas, scribbled prayers left in temples. To my domina, whose hand is gentler than her chains, to my master, who kissed me like I was free. These weren't fantasies, they were confessions of real people caught in something that looked like love, felt like love, but could never be equal. Rome didn't care. As long as property obeyed, what happened behind villa doors was no one's business. Of course, not all Dominus-dominated affairs were tragic. Some owners freed their gladiator lovers. That act, called manumission, was rare, expensive, and usually permanent. Once freed, the gladiator became a libertus, a freedman. They could marry, own property, even start their own ludus. Some did, and some stayed, with the person who had once owned them. Love, gratitude, trauma bond. Rome didn't name it. They just accepted it. There's one preserved will, yes, a literal Roman will, that leaves a house, a vineyard, and 2 rings to "My dearest Felix, once my fighter, now my companion in all things." The document is silent on the nature of their relationship, but the ring sizes match. This wasn't unique. It just wasn't talked about. The elite preferred their secrets kept behind marble walls and under gold-trimmed sheets. And what about same-sex dynamics? They happened too. Masters and male gladiators, mistresses and female slaves. Rome didn't care so long as the lines of ownership stayed clear, but emotions. They blurred those lines. And when love crossed into rebellion, or simply made the owner feel too vulnerable, that's when things got dangerous. Because the moment a gladiator was loved too much, they stopped being a weapon. They started being a threat. In one famous case, a retired lanista was murdered by his former fighter, an act some claimed was revenge for years of abuse. Others said it was because the fighter had loved him and was discarded. The truth died with them both. But there were quieter endings. Owners who set their lovers free, gladiators who stayed by their sides even afterward, tombstones shared, names joined, inscriptions that didn't ask for pity, only remembrance. In the next chapter we'll leave the villas and turn toward the myths, the rumours, the wild whispered stories that gladiators had secret lovers among the gods, divine encounters, cursed romances, and why Venus was said to weep whenever a gladiator fell in love. But for now, let your breath slow. Picture the quiet hush of a candlelit chamber, a gladiator kneeling, a hand extended, not with a whip but with a cup of wine, and 2 people equally trapped by a world that never cared what they felt, only who had the power. Because in ancient Rome, love didn't ask permission. It simply arrived, even when it wasn't welcome. When words failed, the Romans turned to myths. When truths were too heavy, they told stories that blurred the line between reality and something more poetic. And when it came to the private lives of gladiators, their forbidden loves, their tragic endings, their impossible dreams, those stories didn't just survive, they evolved into legend. Because how do you make sense of men who were born slaves, lived like gods and died before they could say goodbye? You tell tales. Tales of gladiators touched by Venus herself, cursed with beauty so dangerous it drove senators to madness and matrons to sin. Tales of fighters who loved each other so deeply that Jupiter turned them into stars so they could orbit one another forever. Tales of gods who punished the empire for tearing apart love it couldn't control. These weren't official myths, mind you. You won't find them etched into marble or recited in temples. These were whispered stories, passed between servants and stable boys, scratched into the backs of amphorae, and shared in secret over wine. But they mattered, because when the real world wouldn't make space for love, myth did. One of the most enduring tales is that of Amarus, a Thracian gladiator said to have been so beautiful that even statues of Apollo turned toward him in the sun. He belonged to a wealthy Roman general whose wife, predictably, fell in love with the young fighter. When their affair was discovered, the general sentenced Amarus to die in the arena, unarmed, against a lion. But according to the story, Venus wept. Her tears became the morning dew, and the lion, seeing her reflection in Amarus's eyes, refused to attack. Instead, it lay at his feet. The crowd erupted. The emperor spared him. The general, humiliated, vanished. And Amarus? He disappeared into legend, some say taken by Venus herself as a temple guardian. Total fiction? Probably. But there are enough carvings, enough poems, enough hints to suggest someone believed it, and more importantly, needed to believe it, because the truth was too bleak. There's another legend, older, darker. Two gladiators, Livius and Certa, were known for fighting together in paired duels. Rumour said they were lovers, bound by oath. One night, a nobleman who fancied Certa bribed a lanista to pit the two men against each other in a special match. Only one could leave. The story goes that they refused to fight, that they stood in the sand back to back and dropped their weapons. The nobleman ordered archers to strike them down. As the first arrow flew, Livius stepped in front of Certa and took it through the heart. Certa, instead of running, kissed his lover's dying lips, picked up his sword, and charged the stands. He never reached them. Both men died. But after their death, flowers grew from the blood-stained sand. White lilies, where nothing had grown before. The crowd took it as a sign. The arena was closed for a week, and in that time someone carved into the entry gate. They died as one. Again, no official records, just a name, just a story. But Rome was built on stories, and the gods were part of it all. Venus, goddess of love and irresistible desire, was often depicted gazing down at the arena. Not in horror, not in judgment, but in heartbreak. The poets claimed she fell in love with mortals all the time. But gladiators, they were her weakness. One bard, whose name is lost but whose verses survive in a single charred scroll, wrote, "When Venus weeps, the sand runs red. She kisses lips the world calls dead." It's not subtle, but it says everything. To love a gladiator was to flirt with grief, and so myth became a balm. If a fighter you adored was killed in the ring, it was easier to believe he'd been taken by the gods, that his spirit now guarded lovers, or whispered through the wind into sleeping ears. Sometimes statues were dedicated not to emperors or warriors, but to unnamed men who fought with passion. Sometimes coins bore marks that historians couldn't explain, two crossed swords entwined with ivy, or stars appearing above a helmeted head. Little clues, little rebellions. Even among the elite, gladiator love became a sort of metaphor, a stand-in for forbidden desire. Poets who couldn't write plainly about their own scandalous romances would write about gladiators instead. Symbols, surrogates, saints of heartbreak. And yet, none of this made the actual lives of gladiators any easier. They still died too young, still bled for sport, still left behind lovers who could never say their names out loud. But in the space where silence lived, myth grew like ivy, twisting around memory, keeping it alive. Up next, we'll leave the myths behind and look at the rarest of outcomes. What happened when a gladiator survived? When he lived long enough to leave the arena, fall in love, and maybe, just maybe, start a family. Because even in Rome, not every love story ended with a funeral. But for now, let your breath slow. Picture torchlight glinting off bronze armour, a crowd gone silent, a gladiator gazing into the sky, whispering to a goddess who never answered, but always watched. Because in ancient Rome, legends were born in blood. But love, that came afterward. The arena was never meant to be permanent. No matter how many times a gladiator fought, no matter how many cheers he earned, the real prize, the secret one, was always the same: to get out. To survive long enough to hang up the sword, feel the sun without squinting against it, and maybe, just maybe, start something that looked like a life. But Rome didn't make that easy. For the lucky few who were granted freedom, either by earning it through victory, being bought and released, or outliving their usefulness, freedom was a strange, slippery thing. It looked good on paper, a scroll, a ceremony, a palm struck with a wooden rod, the mark of manumission. Just like that, you were no longer a slave. You were a libertus, a freedman. Congratulations. Now go figure out who you are without the armour. For some former gladiators, that meant starting a trade, opening a tavern, teaching other fighters, even running their own ludus, hiring out younger men for profit. But for others, it meant chasing something they'd never had before. A home, a wife, maybe children. Not because they'd been dreaming about white picket fences, they didn't exist, but because for once they could. Sort of. Legally, a freed gladiator could marry, own property, start a family. The law allowed it. Society, a little less so. Gladiators carried a reputation. They were seen as dangerous, dirty, hypersexual, great for fantasy, not for family dinners. Some women were brave enough, or desperate enough, to overlook that. A few gladiators married freed women or even citizens from the lower classes. There are tombstones that tell their stories. One reads, "Here lies Marcus Felix, once a fighter, forever my heart." Another, "To Julia, who called me husband, not slave." Sweet, honest, quiet legacies from men who'd once heard thousands chant their names but only cared about one voice by the end. But the illusion of peace didn't last for everyone. For starters, freedmen still owed service to their former masters. That meant obligations, taxes, loyalty, and sometimes silence. If a man had made enemies during his time in the arena, and most did, those enemies didn't just disappear because he started selling figs in the forum. Worse still, the body didn't forget. Gladiators were often released broken, scarred, limping. Many couldn't work in trades that required strength, and pain doesn't pause for romance. Marriage might have been legal, but intimacy wasn't always easy. Some had old wounds, others had older ghosts, and then there was the past. Imagine meeting someone, falling in love, trying to explain in that early nervous way people do what your job used to be. "I used to be a gladiator" wasn't exactly first date material. It came with baggage, blood, names whispered on the wind. Didn't you fight that huge Gaul once? Weren't you the one who lost your eye to a tiger? Is it true what they say about what went on in the barracks? Sometimes the new life was real, but often it was a mask. And yet, some gladiators found real love, built homes, raised children, taught their sons to fish, not to fight, told their daughters stories about lions, but left out the part where their hands once trembled afterward. There are even records of freed gladiators adopting the children of fellow fighters who never made it out. Quiet acts of love that no arena ever applauded. But Rome had a way of pulling people back in. You could leave the sand, but the sand didn't always leave you. One former champion, years into his retirement, was dragged into court for allegedly seducing a married woman. His defense? "She remembered who I was. I forgot." The case was dismissed, but his name was in the gossip scrolls for weeks. Still, for many, the dream of a quiet life was enough. They planted gardens, worshipped at shrines, carved new names for themselves, sometimes literally. Flavius the fighter became Flavius the baker. Crixus the Thracian became father of four. It didn't erase the past, but it dulled its edges. And in the quiet hours when the sun set low and the street vendors packed up, these men, these former warriors, sat beside the ones they loved and held their hands like they were the only prize that ever mattered. Now, let's return to the roar of the crowd, to the rumours and realities of what happened in the arena, not just the blood and spectacle, but the moments when a look across the sand told a love story too dangerous to say aloud. Romance forged in battle, rivalry turned tender, and the strange, sad poetry of affection interrupted by death. Use your imagination to let the crowd fade. Picture a worn-out man planting onions in the dirt, his children chasing each other in the background, and a woman inside calling him in for supper. Because sometimes, after all the fights, a quiet life was the boldest victory of all. The arena was built for blood, not for love. Its stones were laid with cruelty in mind, designed to amplify screams, to carry the crunch of a broken rib up to the gods, or at least to the rich in their shaded seats. But every once in a while, under the blinding sun and the scent of iron, love slipped through the cracks like a weed through marble. It didn't look like poetry. It looked like two men locking eyes just a beat too long before a fight, like a whispered joke behind shields, like pulling your swing at the last moment, not enough to lose, but just enough to leave a bruise instead of a corpse. Because sometimes love happened in the arena, not in spite of the violence, but because of it. The arena was a crucible, a place where fear and pain were stripped away until all that remained was instinct. And in that raw place, connections formed. Strange, fragile, terrifying. You didn't have to speak the same language. You just had to survive together. In paired matches known as gregatim, two gladiators would often fight side by side against wild beasts or larger groups. These bouts required trust. You had to cover your partner's back without hesitation. A single moment of doubt could get you both killed. Over time, that kind of trust hardened into something else. Historians call it camaraderie. The graffiti in Pompeii calls it something else entirely. Valens fought beside Darius and kissed him in victory. Dion saved Icarus from the lion, then slept at his feet. Sword brothers, number lovers. Not official records, not marble inscriptions, but there's truth in those scrawls, because no one risked their life for someone they don't love, not in a place like that. And the audience noticed. They always noticed. One pair of fighters, referred to in sources only as the Red Ones, possibly for their cloaks or hair, were known for their synchronicity in the arena. Fought like dancers, moved like smoke. Spectators adored them. Women threw roses, men threw coins. Children tried to imitate their stance in the streets. They won 8 matches together. In the 9th, one of them slipped. The beast, some say a leopard, took the man's leg in a flash of muscle and teeth. His partner, instead of finishing the fight, dropped his weapon and knelt beside him, shielding him with his body. The crowd roared, some with approval, some with rage. The emperor was not amused. The surviving gladiator was ordered to execute his partner, to prove loyalty to Rome over any personal attachment. He refused. They were both killed. A week later, someone placed 2 carved hearts at the gate of the amphitheatre. No one claimed them. No one needed to. The crowd understood. Of course, not every love story ended in tragedy. Some gladiators fought side by side for years, laughed, sang, shared everything but the sand itself. There were rivalries too, twisted with affection. two men who hated each other so publicly it became theatre, but who, when asked about each other privately, would smile and say, "He's the only man I'd want to die beside." And sometimes they did. The Roman people loved a good rivalry, but what they really adored was drama. A fight between two former partners, gold. The crowd didn't know or care what history those men carried, whether they had trained together, eaten from the same bowl, maybe kissed once in the shadows of the barracks. All the audience wanted was blood, and blood they usually got. But the moments before the final strike, when one fighter hesitated, when his blade hovered just above the chest of the man he once laughed with, those were the moments Rome remembered. Not because they were merciful, but because they were human. One poet, whose work was banned, burned, then rediscovered centuries later, wrote of a match where a gladiator let his opponent kill him, just so the other could live. "I died not for glory, but because he still smiled." Could be fiction, could be truth. With Rome, it's usually both. In the arena, there was no time for declarations, no letters, no goodbyes, just a flash of steel and the hope that, if the end came, it came from someone who knew where not to cut first. In the next and final story, we leave the sand behind. We walk with those left behind, the lovers, the friends, the nameless ones who lit candles at shrines and whispered their grief into wind the empire never listened to. Because love may die quickly in Rome, but memory lingers like smoke on the skin. But for now, breathe slow. Imagine the hush just before the horn sounds. Two men standing across from one another, hearts thundering beneath armour. One nods, the other nods back. 'Cause in the end, love in the arena wasn't about survival. It was about recognition. The arena was loud, brutal, public. But before every match there was always a sliver of stillness. A moment just before the gates opened when everything went quiet. That's when the rituals happened. Not the official ones. Not the blessings from the priests. Or the final sharpening of blades. No. These were different. These were private. This was when gladiators kissed pendants tucked under their tunics, touched rings hidden on leather cords, whispered names beneath their breath like sacred spells. And sometimes, if they had time, if they were lucky, they read letters. Yes, letters. You wouldn't think of gladiators as writers. Most of them weren't even Roman. Some didn't speak Latin. But love doesn't wait for literacy. Messages were carved into wood, scratched into pottery shards, whispered to a scribe and then handed off in secret. Some letters were only a few words. Fight well. Return to me. I dreamed of you again. You promised not to die. Others were longer, full of awkward grammar and bad poetry. One fragment found near a gladiator school in Pompeii reads, "My hands are calloused, but your name is soft. When the sun touches my back, I pretend it's you." Corny? Maybe, but real. And they weren't always romantic. One letter, addressed to a fighter named Numitor, simply said, "Do not lose. I need the winnings." A different kind of motivation. But the most heartbreaking ones were never delivered. Archaeologists have uncovered bundles of letters buried beneath barracks and cells, messages that were meant to be read, but never made it to the hands they were written for. Some were buried with the dead, others were hidden, maybe out of fear, maybe out of shame. One such letter was found in a sealed jar near a training yard in Capua, written by a man named Hilarus to another gladiator called Crispin. The ink was faded but legible. It ended with the line, "If you die, let me die too. Otherwise, who will I laugh with?" Crispin's name later appeared on a list of casualties from a local match, Hilaris never appeared again. These quiet rituals, writing, carving, touching charms, weren't just superstition, they were resistance. A way of saying, "You may own my body, Rome, but not my heart." A way to hold on to love when everything else was designed to break it. And it wasn't just lovers who participated. Some gladiators left tokens for their children, a wax doll, a carved bone animal. One man painted a sun on the wall of his cell, writing underneath it, "For Lucilla, who is afraid of the dark, your father is the sun." When asked how they endured, some fighters said nothing. Others tapped their breastplate, where a scrap of cloth or a lock of hair was sewn inside. That was all they needed, and while the crowd chanted for violence, some of those men stepped into the sand with love tucked beneath their armour. They weren't just fighting for glory, they're fighting to see someone's face again. In one famous instance, a gladiator named Calidus was seen pressing something to his lips just before his final match. The crowd thought it was a lucky charm. Later, it was found to be a note, a single sentence. "You smell like olives and rain." No name, no signature, just longing. In the next and final story, we'll step away from these private moments and into the long shadows they left behind. The aftermath, the graves, the quiet legacy of those who loved gladiators and kept their memories burning in a world that only cared about who won. But for now, let yourself breathe gently. Picture a man alone in a stone cell. The noise of the crowd is distant. His armour is polished. His blade is ready. But in his hand he holds a tiny scrap of cloth, soft, worn, and smelling faintly of rosemary. Because sometimes the most powerful protection wasn't bronze or steel. It was the thought of someone waiting. The sand settles quickly after the final blow. One moment the arena is thunder, stomping feet, thrown roses, a chant that could raise the dead, and the next it's silence. Just a stain in the dust, a helmet left behind, a gate swinging closed on a name the world won't say again. But someone always remembers. Because for every gladiator who died in the arena, someone was left behind. A lover, a friend, a servant who brought his meals, a woman who snuck him bread and once told him not to die today. They couldn't always scream his name as he fell. But after was different. They built altars, carved his face into stone, whispered his name to the wind when no one else was listening. And that's where the real love stories lived, not in the heat of battle, but in the quiet that followed. Gladiators were buried like champions, or like dogs. It depended on their fame, on their owner's pride, on whether anyone had enough coins left for a proper tomb. Some were dumped in mass graves outside the city. Others had funerals paid for by adoring fans or secret lovers. In rare cases, even by former masters who couldn't quite explain why they were crying. But some had shrines, small ones, a carved bust, a name scratched into limestone, a phrase like, "He fought well," or "He smiled before the sword." One grave in Ostia reads, "To Lucius, my light in the darkness, your warmth stays in the sheets." Another, "He died beneath the sun. I still feel it burn." No rank, no titles, just memory. There are tombs that historians call ambiguous. Two men buried side by side, no family relation, joint inscriptions, identical funeral goods. Lovers? Brothers in arms? Rome didn't record the difference. And maybe it didn't matter, because someone made sure they stayed together. The ones who loved them did what they could. They visited the graves, left figs, wine, olive branches. One woman in Pompeii reportedly returned every week for a year to the grave of a gladiator named Tiro, left letters, scraps of papyrus folded carefully. They were never opened, but they were found hundreds of years later, sealed in clay. You said you'd come back. The amphora still smells like you. Maybe Tiro was a lover, a brother, a son. Maybe all three. The words didn't say, but they said enough. And sometimes the love was angry, graffiti cursing the crowd, lines etched in fury. He fought for them, and they watched him bleed. You clapped while he died. Because grief has teeth too. The gladiators who survived didn't always talk about it. Some returned to the arena, not to fight, but to sit in the back rows, watch the dust and remember. Others turned bitter, or devout, or quiet. One retired fighter became a priest of Mercury and swore off all violence. Another married the sister of a man he once killed. Life in Rome was nothing if not dramatic. But always, always, the memory stayed. In households across the empire, tiny wax figures of gladiators stood on shelves. Not trophies, but tokens. Inscriptions under them said things like, "Be strong like him," or "He smiled even in chains." Children played with them. Mothers kissed their heads before bed. Somewhere along the line, the man beneath the armour became myth again. But the people who knew him, they remembered the calluses, the crooked tooth, the way he said thank you like it cost him something. They remembered the dreams he spoke of once, when he thought no one was listening. And maybe, just maybe, they whispered his name one last time as they fell asleep, letting it curl around their breath like a lullaby. Because even in Rome, where death was a spectacle and love was a liability, tenderness found a way. This series began with steel and sweat, with myth and madness, but it ends here, in the silence, in the dust that remembers, in the hands that built graves for men the world called disposable, but someone called beloved. And if you've stayed awake through it all, if your mind wandered with us through the barracks, the bedrooms, the arenas, and the tombs, I thank you. If these stories moved you, even just a little, feel free to like the video and subscribe. It helps me keep these forgotten voices echoing just a little longer. And if your eyes are heavy, let them close now. Sleep easy to the soft hum of torchlight and the gentle shuffle of sandals down a colonnade. The fight is over. And love. It never really left the arena.